And there it is, the border to Bregisland, known affectionately as the Dower Fens. It's nothing but stinking bogs and marshland from here to the sea. Can't say it appeals to me that much, but for the Bregas it offers privacy and freedom that is rare to find in most of the Empire. The locals can be a little eccentric and wary of strangers, but they are a proud and stubborn people. You have to be to make a life in such a hostile environment.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the LARP News podcast. Today we're coming back up north to go and talk to PD, and I've got a couple of members here from Profound Decisions who we're going to talk about a few things to do with Empire. If you'd like to introduce yourselves again and let us know who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Matt Pennington. I'm a member of the game team and I own and run Profound Decisions, so I handle the sort of real world stuff and then I contribute to the plot and the campaign.
Can I just get you to move in slightly?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm Andy Raff. I work for PD. I do a lot of the writing and campaign design and world building for the game.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. We spoke a year ago, and kind of like I tried to re-listen to that episode on my drive up here, and I found my questions and my knowledge so cringy I couldn't get to the end of the episode. So hopefully this time round, a little bit more knowledge on my end, a little bit more coherent questions, rather than not knowing that the Winter Mark is made up of 3 different identities, which is when I had to turn the episode off because it was that cringy. But right, let's talk about world building, because it's something that me and Ian have both been looking into and kind of wikiing up, and kind of the idea of when Empire was just a seedling and you were coming up with the concept of Empire, how many different... Because there's obviously mechanics of the gameplay and the world itself. Now, where do these start to join? Where does the seed come from? And how do these all work together, you know?
So, the game world's put together from 2 different competing directions. There's a look and feel, there's a visual. There are only so many different visual aesthetics that you can come up with. Well, I couldn't come up with any because I have no visual imagination.
We made a big list of what we thought looked good on the understanding that we were aiming for a medieval feel.
Yeah, so we put together an art team. We include artists, costume designers, people really strong on the practical side. And they began to pull together visuals and going, well, there could be a people that look like this and dress like this. While that's happening, you've then got a bunch of creatives who are really just throwing thousands of words at a blackboard to see what sticks. And they would come up with conceptuals, early kind of, well, it could be a nation like this, there could be a people like this.
And is this starting with the nations that make up the Empire itself at this stage?
At one point, Empire was a PvP game set in a Balkan-like state in a steampunk era, in which a revolution had just taken place.
Yeah,
that was our initial point coming out of Maelstrom.
Yeah.
Then we went through a lot of discussions about it, about whether that was going to be fun. We accidentally, one of us, I forget who, it was me, reinvented the Lorien Trust Ritual of Peace as an explanation as to how all these people could get together, and we realised that wasn't going to work, and we came around to the idea of having an empire, having a stable situation. And then we went with the medieval setting and started working on the look and feel. We were still kicking ideas around about things that would be cool, talking about magic, where we're going to have gods, so broad strokes. And once we'd got the list of, I think it was about a dozen look and feel, solid look and feel things, which were photos, that's the point at which we started to talk about, well, this nation of people in plate mail, because that Arthurian look is good, here's some ideas about what they might be. We talked about Dawn. We discussed whether the sort of the High Guard look, how that would fit. We knew we wanted some broad themes, but it wasn't until we got the look and feel that we started to nail down, to begin to nail down the actual nations.
Yeah, I can't remember how much we'd written before we introduced the visuals to the process.
We had a forum called Drittenspiel, because for a while the game was called Third Game in German, with the penguin font. And we had a load of stuff on there, almost none of it, with the exception, I think, of Greater Radsborn, which was the original version of the Marches, a sort of pastoral English agricultural apple-based society, actually made it into the game. No. Not a lot of it. We had all sorts of crazy stuff. I don't suppose you remember Quantum Voodoo Snake Gods?
I don't remember.
No, a lot of maths in that one. And then we had a lot of cool ideas on that. And some of it went through Craig Burnett's idea of no resistances, because resistances is annoying for the person using an ability.
And sucks.
Yeah, that was a
as in
key
the ability
thing.
to ignore.
Yes, to say no effect. It's not really resistance, because we do have some elements of that around our heavy armour rules. But Craig pointed out, and we had a long discussion about the fact, again, coming out of Maelstrom, which had a lot of weird different resistances, that somebody being able to say, your ability doesn't affect me,
It's breaking.
It's not a good experience for the person doing the hitting.
Yeah.
Well, I'd agree. The heavy armor is a very, like, if you shoot someone with an arrow and they're wearing heavy armor, it's a very easily visual display. It's also it's something easily communicated, for example, by tapping on the chest or something else where it isn't necessarily immersion breaking.
There was the other element it has that's nice. It's got a sort of what you see is what you get idea to it. You're not usually unsure if your ability is going to work or not, because most of the time when you're doing a no effect, it's because you have a special skill or ability that isn't visually.
You're talking about rules there, and I think so at some points the rules influences rules and setting design. You can't divorce them completely. I mean, I have no interest in the approach to role playing that says let's create a completely universal set of rules. None whatsoever. I think it's a flawed concept. The rules support the aesthetics and the conceptuals of the game that you're trying to bring together. You don't need complicated rules for melee if you're running a futuristic sci-fi game where everyone's got guns. The rules are designed in tandem with the world, because you look at the concepts and the things that are coming together in the world and go, okay, well, the rules can support that like this. But generally, it's a parallel development to some extent, but each has to keep its eye on the other. But yeah, basically, we did endless sequencing of throwing ideas, and the early stuff was all about throwing ideas. Then at the point where we got the core game concept, and the core game concept is it's one empire, made up of a bunch of nations, so you have a shared loyalty and a rivalry. From the outset, you have a shared loyalty and a rivalry, which solves all those problems about why are we turning up in a field. If we hate each other and want to kill each other, why on earth are we in a field together? Something that literally made no sense for the 9 years that we ran it for Maelstrom, where people who hated each other would all turn up in a field 4 times a year for no good reason at all.
I think
The festivals that were supposed to be a time of peace for everybody to come together were provably much more dangerous than the other 12 months of the year.
You got that concept. You got a shared loyalty, a single shared underlying loyalty with rivalries, not hatreds, rivalries, and so forth. And then we began to basically go, okay, of all these crazy ideas for worlds and nations and settings and people and races, what starts to come together? And then we would pick out the best ideas, and then we formed little writing teams, and we said, Ian, Rachel, Damo, can you develop that? Harry and your team, can you develop that? And then they would take what looked like the kernel of a good idea. They would spend 2-3 weeks writing that out into sort of 3,000 or 4,000 words, and then it went back to me and you, and we would go through it with a fine-tooth comb and look at it and see whether it had worked, what needed editing. And effectively what we had was a bunch of writers creating lots of individual content, and then you and me were then bringing it back to coherence.
And our emphasis all the time was on what we'll play on the field.
Yeah, that's really important.
How will this be fun to do in uptime for players?
Yeah.
as a player, that's how it plays, right? Like, so I'm a Navarre, I'm proud of my nation as a Navari, but I have certain feelings towards other nations and other groups. Like, I have friends who are flat out racist against orcs, and I forget. I'll be like, hey, I'm going to go and see an orc friend of mine or whatever, and they're like, what, some orc scum that doesn't have a soul? And I'm like, oh, I forgot that you dislike those people or whatever. Yeah, you're a nice guy, but a massive racist, So, I think that's very true. Like, especially when you see the different nations interacting with each other. Like, there was a good acid test of that, which is there's not enough room to go on a skirmish, and you have different nations show up, and how they all kind of act towards who deserves to go on said skirmish. It's, so maybe more aggressive Dornish players would like to go, for example. It's good fun.
I've just remembered, it's a slight tangent, but there is a skirmish element to it. Do you remember the version of Empire that was set on Mars in the far future? and you travelled back through the Sentinel Gate to the past to steal resources, steal water from people so that you could survive, and nobody had any idea what had caused the ecological disaster that had destroyed the otherwise lush surface of Mars.
Well, obviously, it would eventually become apparent that it was people from the future coming back.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And weirdly enough, one of the key problems we decided that wouldn't work with that otherwise genius setting was that there weren't many deserts in England that we could hire to do LARP events on.
Can we run our game up Candleston? It was and that was a brilliant 50-person game. I'm really proud of that 50-person game, and it would have been a great 50-person LARP. 50 LARPers.
But even that gave us some things, because a lot of the stuff we were talking about those raids back into the Pass of Steel Water, laid some of the foundation for where we went with things like skirmishes and battles. We knew we wanted people to leave the safe location to go to dangerous locations to do adventurous stuff, and then come back to the safe location, even at that point of the game. Yeah. When it was on Mars in the future.
This is another question I was going to lead to anyway, but it's a good time to bring it up. Scale. Right? Because there is a difference, like you were just alluding to just then, there is a difference between a 25-person, a 50-person, a 100-person, and now we're at, 2,000 people attending Empire?
2,100.
Yeah.
It's big.
So, we'll go into this now because we're talking about it, but scaling, has that been a challenge? Have you been a victim of your success, basically? Is there any aspects of that?
I don't think so. I mean, people are always asking me that question. When I say that game we talked about just then, where they were going back in time and blah, 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 would have been a great 50-person LARP, that's not because the game was set up to serve 50 people. That's because, in my opinion, it would have interested 50 people. It just didn't have a broad mass appeal. There's two parts to game design. One is how many people will want to play your game, and two is how many people do you want to play your game, and those two are very, very different things. We're a commercial LARP company, so at the end of the day, we're always trying to run big LARPs. There is no part of Profound Decisions is set up to commercially, profitably run 50-person LARPs. I don't want to say it can't be done, because the moment I say that, someone will prove me wrong. But, for us, the economics of it, our analysis breaks down very clearly that you want over 1,000 players to be in the regime where you might be a commercial LARP. So we were always trying to build a giant, massively multiplayer game where it's all about a persistent world, and you moving through the world and meeting these hundreds and thousands of different characters and having those interactions, and those interactions being meaningful and important. So we were always trying to build for that scale. Empire has approximately close to doubled in size over the last 3 years. It's gone from sort of 1,300 players to 2,100, and that hasn't really made any difference to us. We're a bit busier on the phones, a bit busier on the emails.
Part of it, I think, comes down to the way we approach the design. There's a lot of different approaches to LARP. One of them is a lot of things are about NPCs bringing you information. You interact with the NPCs, and game develops around that. Because we wanted to build a big game, we would need 100 NPCs constantly being active to provide, to serve game to 1,000 players, and that wouldn't scale.
Yeah,
wouldn't scale. So we tried as much as possible to build the game around the idea that 90% of the stuff that's going on at Empire with players interacting with each other. We can give them things to interact about. We give them levers, which are ways for them to change the game or to achieve things and things along those lines. And we rely on emergent narrative of lots of different players and characters with different agendas they've created themselves, bumping into each other, interacting with the things that we're creating, and then producing the game themselves. And that does scale up.
That does scale, and that's the point, really. And I think if you look at, my hunch is that there is LARP that there's a structural design to LARP around 5 to 20 players. There's a structural design to a LARP that is between sort of 25 and 75 players. There's a kind of LARP around the 75 to 150 people. And then once you're past that, if you've designed your game to have more than 150 players, I don't understand why it would suffer if there were suddenly 2,000 players, because it was designed with players interacting with players. If you've done your job right, and that is my opinion, then it will be designed with around players interacting with players. At which point, the more players there are, the more interactions there are, the more game is. It comes down to something I've argued for a long time. It's about ratios. If you go to a 20-person LARP, there's probably 20 players and maybe 10 NPCs. So at any given time, you're 33% likely to be interacting with an NPC, because they're 1 out of 3 people at the event is an NPC. If not more, if you consider people are going out as one character and coming back in with another. The majority, therefore, of your important interactions will be with an NPC. And so the NPCs become a natural tool for you to create game out of, because lots of players are interacting with them all the time, and they're a very powerful device that you can use to do that with. That does not work for shit in a large game. I have a huge crew. I have 400 crew. But 50 of those are doing tents. The actual number of NPCs I've got is probably only about 30 at an event. So I've got 2,000 players and 30 NPCs that are going out in plot roles. So you just need to run the statistics through your head and realise probably many players will never meet an NPC the entire weekend. So how are you going to keep a person busy through their interactions with your NPC that they're never even going to meet? Never going to meet that character. The important interaction in a massive fest game is players with players. And if your game is not built from the ground up with the understanding that those are the important interactions, then you're not building a fest game.
Well, that was a question from Matthew. I'm going to butcher your surname, sir. I apologise. Sledgeman. He's actually from South Africa.
Right.
So that's kind of cool. So there you go, Matthew. I hope that helps you with your own games in South Africa. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, if you're interested, Matthew, in those kind of, I could talk for hours about these kind of design and does. Yeah, so feel free to drop me an email if you want. You've got more questions on that.
There you go, wicked. I found the. So when you're building. So we've got the empire, right? Mm-hmm. You've got your nations. We went through different themes and how they maybe interact with each other. How do you design the history of the empire? Because there's an extensive canon on how the empire got to where we are now, or at least when the empire started. How do you going through and building a history for a fictional world?
So let me think. We had a lot of phone calls. Once we'd settled on the idea of an empire, we talked quite a lot backwards and forwards. We nailed down 2 key events. We knew that we wanted the empire to begin with an empress bringing people together at a time when humans were being threatened by orc barbarians.
Yep.
And we knew we wanted the game to start with the throne having been catastrophically emptied, because that gave us an opportunity to use, the time of crisis? I forget what we called it. We came up with some bullshit name for it that explained why, under certain circumstances, if an empress had been killed on a Thursday and all of her friends had also been killed on a Thursday, then we emptied all the positions and everybody got to elect their senators and generals again. And then we used that for about a year as an excuse for every change we wanted to make. And then we used it for another year when it was starting to get a bit tried out. So those were the 2 bits we knew we wanted. We knew we had a bit of a theme. We talked a little bit about how some of the humans would have different origins, because that would allow us to shake things up. And then we left the history until after the writers had done their pitches on their nations. And one of the things we wanted from all of them was a history.
Yeah.
And obviously they were writing those in isolation, but that gave us a number of different approaches.
Hooks in those stories.
Hooks,
maybe.
Yes. A lot of the writing of the wiki is about creating hooks. And then we sat down over a weekend and banged our heads against how we can make all these different things line up. We did edits and similar. And then that gave us a framework for the early history of the Empire and the prehistory of the Empire in some cases, like Highguard arriving on the boats, for example.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The Empire started with Highguard arriving on boats in the north, and then...
Highguard arrives in the south.
Oh, sorry.
On the Bay of Katazar. And that's a point where people say that's when the first humans are here. But obviously, because we like a bit of political satire, there's thousands and thousands of humans already living here, but they don't really count because they're not the Highguard and they haven't just turned up on boats to create a new colony. So all the Navarre and the Suak and the Urizen and the Varushkans are sort of, the Yushkans, are looking askance at the idea that the Highborn is the point at which people start civilising the area.
The Vard and the
The Vard and the
Steiner.
Steiner come later, but the Ushkins are already here. Have you not read the bit about the people of the North and their complex scholastic origin stories, as
Sure.
per a 4,000-word document on the wiki?
I've probably read it, but I thought, I just thought the Vard and the Steiner fell to earth before the.
No, they come later.
Well, it's interesting because this is what actually what I wanted to go into. Even reading through some of the historical
Right.
aspects to it.
I can't remember. You might be right. Even I can't keep it entirely straight. I think. Let me think. Do we mention? We don't mention Highguard or Dawn in that particular story. We do mention Navarre, because the Vard and the Navarre have a tussle.
Point is, we don't know, and we'd have to check.
We have to check.
But one of the things is
It's
that
like real history.
going through it, like Ian's working on something at the moment, which is like a history of the Empire, and there are vaguisms lost in the memories of time, right?
Yeah.
There are versions of events, but they could be very, very, as our own ancient history is. You have to take everything with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
Is this a moral story or is this a real story?
That
for
was an
example?
early historical event that we nailed down. Not exactly when it happened, but we knew it had happened. God bless Nicovar.
Yes.
Nicovar burns down all the libraries, means that we don't have to create a D&D style campaign guide that details every year of the history back 4,000 years.
Yeah.
It was a brainwave that gave us an opportunity to just burn all the
Also, there
documents.
aren't libraries everywhere.
Also, there aren't libraries everywhere. Nobody's got the internet. So we were
God bless you,
intentionally
Nicovar.
able to leave big chunks of time vague, so that we could either go back and develop events in them later, or plot writers can go back and develop events in them, or better yet, we can just leave them with unanswered questions and let players argue about what their characters think was the important fact.
But to go to your question, I think, the classic has got to be the Vard and the Steiner, who, according to their history, fall to earth. They literally fall out of the sky, and that's how they arrive here. Is that true? Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not going to answer that now, neither in a million years. It's easy to see that as a metaphor. It's absolutely, it just screams metaphor. It must be a metaphor for something. They clearly can't have just fallen out of the sky. But equally, this is a fantasy setting, and me and Raff are quite deliberately contrary at times.
The Steiner and the Vard get a lot of the press, but we shouldn't forget that the Suak claim that they are descended from a magical woman on a mammoth who comes out of the frozen north, and half of whom's children turn into seals.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a metaphor until the Hilger plot starts to develop, in which there really are shape-changing seals in Surma
Who regard the Suak as their brothers and
believe the
sisters.
Suak as their relatives,
kind of
and it
gives
raises
you-
questions.
It kind of gives you the ability to add plot now that might be relevant to something that is vague or something that could be controversial to a different nation, right? Their versions of how things happened might well turn out to be something very interesting.
We were building for the long term, so we've put some obvious mysteries in that we knew we wanted to develop over the course of the campaign, and a couple of those are only really beginning to come out sort of 7 years in, and they're not the big ones either. Well, one was quite big, but not big world-changing things. But we also just threw loads and loads of stuff in as well that we had no intention really of developing, but was there to give other writers and even player events in some circumstances. There's been at least one Navarre player event that's built on just a throwaway line on on one of the territory pages, because we wanted there to be rich stuff there. Because the advantage it gives you is if somebody goes and develops something about the Semistones, for example, a chunk of the players who are interacting with that plot about the Semistones will already know that is a place in Dawn which has a powerful and mysterious summer aura.
Can you just explain what that is?
It's a place in Dawn that has a powerful and mysterious summer aura.
That's all there is.
And that's all there is. That's all we've written. But as soon as the plot writer starts to develop that, they and the players who come to interact with that bit of plot know that there is something, know a baseline information about it, and that makes it feel like it was all planned from the very beginning, and like the world is real. Or more real at any rate, rather than having every plot writer pull a different magical location out of their backsides for every plot they do.
Yeah, I've played a lot of ongoing fantasy games in which, there is a monster du jour, or even a monstrous invading race du jour. Literally this monstrous race that no one had heard of 3 months ago turns up out of nowhere and is now threatening the entire world and will hang around for a year and then it'll be defeated and then another new terrible. And you're like, I'm not. Yes, I am going to criticise. The weakness of that approach is that it undermines the reality of the world. It makes the world feel shallow and unbelievable. But when these things have got tiebacks. You go, oh, yeah, there's always been strange shadowy creatures seen around the Semi-Stones, and now strange shadowy creatures are issuing forth from the Semi-Stones. It's like, that's a problem we knew about all along. Suddenly, it makes it when you introduce a new element, if you're picking up and raising up out of the kind of the backdrop an element that everybody was conscious of, or not even everyone, just even 2 or 3 characters, you just need 2 or 3 characters to be able to credibly say, oh yeah, I live near the Sunstones, this has always been a problem.
There's a couple of
and suddenly it's believable.
There's a couple of strong examples of that in the way we set stuff up. So, for example, with the Eternals, we said we're going to have a roster of Eternals. We might expand that, but it would be a big deal if we expand it. So when a plot writer came to us in the first couple of years saying, I've got this great idea for an Eternal who is like this, we would say, that's cool, but you could run exactly the same plot using this Eternal that already exists.
Yeah.
And because you're not creating a new element that is cool and exciting that we can see future plot writers dealing with, we'd rather use the stuff that's already been created. We've added to the Eternals, but not a lot. We did exactly the same thing with races. Neither of us, we tell different anecdotes, but neither of us has any patience for those worlds where there's 500 different types of humanoid creature. So we nailed down fairly early on that we were doing humans and orcs.
With lineages.
Humans with lineages, orcs, and a couple of other bits and bobs. So we mentioned the Dave, the Vaguely, there's trolls, I mentioned a few others. But the majority of those were mysterious and not appearing in this movie. We were not going to pepper the world with Skaven, for example.
Or red elves and blue elves.
Or red elves and blue elves,
elves
or beast men, or 6 different types of lizard men who differ only in the addition to their hit dice. That's my bugbear.
Yeah, the point though is that when you're creating that world, particularly when it's a closed world, and there's an inherent contradiction in a closed world. You go, okay, this is a closed world, we're not going to bring new stuff into it over time, except you clearly are, because as a plot writer you're constantly bringing and developing new ideas. Well, how on earth does that work? Well, it's a shitload of work, but what we do in Empire is, we basically wrote 1 billion words, edited it down to the core elements, and every page of the wiki, if it's a territory page or it's a history page, is raising as many questions as it answers as you're reading it. You're just thinking, what the hell is that? Who are these people? What's going on there? Why is this mysterious thing happening?
I've been on going down a wiki hole often, because I'll be reading something and they'll reference something and I'll be like, I don't know what that is. Yeah. So then you end up going through to find out what that is, and then you expand your knowledge on a whole different aspect.
It can be intimidating, mind. It does have downsides. We see new players often. Well, not new players often, but we'll often see a post in which usually a new player will say, there's so much wiki, where do I even start?
Yeah. Look, from my point of view, being dyslexic, I found it incredibly intimidating. But one thing I have realised now is, yes, maybe 1 or 2 events, there are certain phrases that you're just not going to know, right? Yeah. And it can be quite awkward for some people just to ask, I don't know what that is, could you explain it to me? Which is nice because the community is pretty good and actually going through that stuff. But I've learned a lot through the game, right? So by interacting with people, having plot devices actually affecting the world that I'm living in makes me learn about different things. Also different people's opinions on things, because there's a wonderful fake news vibe when you're actually at the event, where different people will tell you the same, something happened, but you'll hear vastly different versions of those events,
Yes.
And Andy, thank you very much for doing your Foreign Nations YouTube channel.
Yes, I discovered I could make videos on my phone, and then I thought I'll start with the Foreign Nations, because diplomatic plot is not something I think that the majority of players, it's not an obvious thing for people to know about, but it's something that was very much in our Winds of Fortune over the last year. I've got the Jarm one to come. I was putting it off until the end of the year because I knew there was some Jarm.
Best Foreign Nation.
I knew there was some Jarm developments coming. Once that's finished, I've been chatting with the people about which they prefer, and we'll either do Nations of the Empire, which I think is a little risky, or it's been suggested that an Eternal rundown might be interesting. Because again, really that's an element of the game that not every player.
That would be a great chance to just get some core concepts about Eternals across. Like, if you cast a ritual linked to an Eternal, the Eternal is doing you a favour, you're not doing the Eternal a favour.
There's a lot of different ways we can go, but I can get another 7 bits of content out of that. It's all about content.
Oh, no. Quality over content, Yeah, like the Foreign Nation. We spoke briefly before we started recording, but the Foreign Nation game is kind of has absolutely taken me and off to a different thing. You know, it's learning about them and the world that we're living in now, and where the Empire's potentially heading into what could be. I'm not going to say the First World War because I'm assuming there are potentially wars, ancient wars that we might not know about, but there is a kind of gearing towards a larger conflict.
I mean.
Right?
Arguably, you need to be at a certain level of technology to have a world war.
Just to get people where they need to go, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure really. And there's an argument about what actually constitutes a world war in a game like Empire. We are unlikely to be sending imperial armies across the seas to fight in France.
I think, again, I'm not knowledgeable about history, but I think when was the Japanese invasion of Manchuria?
That would have been like mid-30s, early 30s, yeah.
And as you put, so
they took over, they had Korea, then they had Manchuria, and that's, I think it was 36, 37 when they actually invaded China. Right. So that was the big send-off that actually kicked off that whole regional war, you know?
Yeah, is that part of the Second World War? I think the point is, I think I'd argue the real lie is the First World War, because it clearly isn't a world war. I can't. The First World War, the theatre that everyone is familiar with, is the kind of the European fault line. I know there's an attempt to open up a front in Gallipoli, and there's soldiers from all over the world, and I think that is the argument for why it's a world war. You know, there's Anzacs and you know, there's the British brought soldiers in from all over the world. But if you look at the Second World War, you know, America is fighting in Europe and it's fighting in the Pacific. So Germany is fighting in Russia on the Russian front, and it's fighting in
Europe, North Africa.
So nations are in multiple theatres, and I think that is a definition of a world war that you won't see in Empire, because the technology doesn't support it. The Jarmish are not going to put 4 armies on the Bay of Catazar, or 4 navies on the Bay of Catazar with armies on ready to roll. But what you might see is the Jarmish saying, "We've had enough of these Empire. Let's bankroll the Grendel and sell them cheap warships and so
you could also see militias and mercenaries potentially from different nations showing up and supporting elite units.
And from the Empire's point of view, we talked very briefly about the fact that the Liberty Pact now exists, but 2 members of the Liberty Pact are caught in cold or increasingly open wars with 2 other large nations. Will be looking to their allies for assistance. So the Empire is likely to see a sort of a political and economic crisis, as it is called, on to try and help people fight the Jarmish over a country they'll never visit.
Let's stop for a second. If you're unaware, the Liberty Pact is a treaty made up of nations that are against slavery, effectively, or receiving profits from slavery. So effectively, if a nation has slaves, then there is a trade embargo or tax on people that trading with these nations, a la First World War. When you start having trade wars and tariffs and embargoes, it starts to build tension. So there is basically a fault line at the moment between the ones that have signed the Liberty Pact and ones that haven't, effectively.
The really nice bit about all of this is that none of it's plot, not in the way people normally think of plot. This has all come out of players using the diplomatic corps, effectively, the players who are ambassadors, to negotiate with the foreign nations and put forward their arguments. And then at the start of the year, obviously, it culminated in a meeting on the field in which players and NPCs, who we'd very intentionally sent in with all the NPCs had at least one major thing we thought might be problematic for the Empire,
like a gripe or something, something to compromise on.
A compromise. So, for example, our Sumar delegate wanted no trade at all with foreigners, and there needed to be a bit of give and take. It was one of our most complicated pieces of diplomatic plot, I think. And then we just left it to the players, and they came to their final Liberty Pact, convinced the NPCs it was a good idea, signed it all up, and created this first international association of nations, which was brilliant for about 25 minutes. And then more problems started to develop in it because we can't help ourselves. Yeah. But it's all come from players. It's not our plot. We don't really run plot.
Is the Liberty Pact a military alliance, or is it purely trade at this stage?
I'm not sure. I think there's some elements that I think there might be some elements on it.
Players are better positioned to answer that question than we are.
I love it. That's
We look forward to them telling us
it's a
whether they
very
think it's a military
telling
alliance
answer.
or responding to it when the Commonwealth say, clearly the intention of the Liberty Pact is you should give us all of your troops and warships to defeat slavery.
Yeah.
Clearly that's what it means.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it very interesting looking at the world that we live in now in Empire, where 3-4 generations orcs were slaves, right?
Yeah.
So is that kind of like, are we morally grandstanding the fact is that we are where we are now, whereas a couple of generations ago potentially we would be on the other side of that conflict potentially? You know, it's a kind of interesting to see where we're at.
Maybe not. So the Sumo would have been passionately anti-slavery 70 years ago in Empire's history, but they wouldn't have regarded the orcs as humans. So that would, wouldn't have. They don't regard keeping an oxen as keeping a slave. I think the Commonwealth have always regarded orcs as people.
The Commonwealth have, yes, but they're the young nation who previously had very different opinions on things.
But yes, without a doubt, that there's a relativistic effect going on here, that the Empire is taking a very high moral ground over the issue of slavery. But it really wasn't that long ago that it was a powerfully race-based slavery.
There's a criticism which I've seen put forward, and I don't entirely disagree with it, but I don't entirely buy into it, that slavery has become, for the players, an easy touchstone for good and evil. But it makes me laugh, because as you say, up until very recently, the Sumo didn't think orcs were people. And I'm still not entirely convinced by that idea. They don't have slaves, but they still slaughtered orcs whenever they got the opportunity. The Empire has outlawed slavery for the last 50 years or so, but they still murder large numbers of people with cursing rituals, or stick people on spikes with their quality keywords, and make compromises. One of the people who's joined the Liberty Pact has cheerfully given up slavery because they weren't really doing it anyway. But they still think the Empire is basically a hotbed of lunatics who worship an evil creator. Good and evil is more complicated than slavery. It's just, for us, it's a social issue kind of thing.
I've seen this happen on the field a few times, where our modern day sensibilities, and this is a very dangerous thing whenever you're looking back at anything in the past, right? Like there are people that we still consider to this day to be heroes, but when you dig deep into their past, they're morally bankrupt under today's standards. Do you think that there's an element of like people's view of the world today affects game?
I'll take a controversial opinion. Far less than people think.
Interesting. Okay.
Far less than people think. The classic is slavery. The classic issue in live role playing is slavery, because whenever you put slavery as an issue into a live role playing game, people are up in arms and want to oppose it. And then people will go, "Oh, 21st century values. It's so tedious," with apparently a complete blindness to the fact that there's been a historical opposition to slavery for 1,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, but arguably you could say that slavery for the vast majority of the world was standard operating procedure until potentially the 1600s.
I don't know how far back, but I bet you could squeeze back and start to root through the 14th and 15th century and find various forms of opposition to slavery in the Here's the critical point, though. Here's the absolutely critical point. If you want your player base to have a more nuanced view of slavery, economically incentivise them to keep slaves. And the moment you do that, you find all their 21st century, and I'm using air quotes, values start to leak out. Because actually, it's what people are opposed to is people keeping slaves and me not getting any economic benefit from that. Right? If you've got slaves, that's an outrage.
A slave.
But my indentured servants are paying off their duty to society. Your slaves is an utter disgrace.
Matt's referring to one of the early games we ran, to Maelstrom, in which the slave trade
was an active component that brought you direct economic
and
benefit.
it gave you direct economic benefit.
The people who didn't have slaves were outraged, but everybody else found.
The saddest part was that several of the people who were outraged about slavery on the field were perfectly happy about their indentured servants. Did they use different rules to slavery, those indentured servants, Matt? They did not, because they were slaves.
Because they were slaves.
It's an odd one. I occasionally get a bit cautious about talking about
the real 21st century values is kidding yourself that what you're doing is a moral high ground, and that isn't 21st century.
It's actually
human quality since through.
I was thinking more of the Briar storyline, the recent one that happened, because that was really interesting from my point of view. Because when I read the wiki, I see Briars as, at the end of the description, they will eventually become extremely dangerous and just start attacking things and people, right?
Yeah.
So my cold, unemotional head goes, well, they're the enemy, right? Like, you've got to be careful. Why on earth would you give these people the time of day if they can literally be a threat to you? And then we come into, the end of this year, and then all of a sudden there are very real worlds. The Vlorn is affecting the Briars, and how does that work?
Part
and there
of
are
that is
visual
around
symbols and dreams,
Part of that is around what lineage is and what it represents. We didn't want to do, as we said earlier on, a bunch of different races, but we still wanted to have our cake and eat it. Races in the fantasy terminology. To have our cake and eat it and still have elves. That's where we started. And so, and ever since I played a Minotaur at Omega, I've quite liked the idea of having people with horns on their heads because they're cool and fun.
Horns work really well.
Horns work really well.
And it looks great, right? It's
largely does. And we had a couple of visual signifiers like that. So what we did was we came up with this idea of lineage and we said we'll have humans, but we'll tie them into the magical realms. So these are people who are affected by magic. They're people who are changed by exposure to magic. And that led us to the idea of, as well as having the physical role-playing physical trappings, we have the role-playing trappings. And that led us, all of the lineages have a bit at the end that says may degenerate into madness. And what that's meant to represent is that the power of the magical realm overcomes their humanity kind of thing. But you don't have to go there if you don't want to. That is a role-playing hook for you. But it's also there to create a scenario where you can happily role-play being suspicious of the lineage. And part of that comes down to the way we put Highguard together. We didn't want the Highborn to just be bad people who were prejudiced and hated the lineage. We wanted to create a space where the Highborn could say, it's not that we're prejudiced against them, it's that because they are affected by the magical realms, by magical energy, they can act weirdly and they can become dangerous.
But you've got a basis for that.
So you've got a basis, yes. You've got a basis. And it's risky. There are some real world resonances that are not positive, but
to be honest, it's like maybe it's just me, and I'm sure some listeners will disagree, but I find the idea of being able to play around with very serious real world issues in a fantasy environment extremely alluring. Like, I like the concept behind it. My previous character was extremely anti-Briar. Like, I would be outright disgusted by the presence of one around me, and it's just like that goes against a lot of my own personal beliefs, but it was a very interesting thing to be and to experience and to role play in my mind.
I just want to go back. There's 2 points there. I want to go back to the slavery one for a nanosecond.
Sure.
The point is with slavery and empire is that we were not interested in making slavery an issue of contention within the empire, as in, are we for slavery, are we against it? So we wrote a heroic story in which they transcend their slave-owning history, because we wanted to get to a point where everybody broadly agreed, with some sort of recidivism of people going, well, yeah, but orcs, but everyone broadly agreed, no, slavery bad. So that it gets you to a common point, a common moral point. The plot of the game is not are you for or against slavery. The plot of the game, in that sense, the campaign is, how do you compromise those views when dealing with other nations and other people who don't share them? And what compromises do you make? If we had wanted to make slavery a conflictional issue within the empire, I would have just come along and written the economic base. Yeah, there's widespread extensive slavery. You can free all those slaves and outlaw slavery at any point, but you'll have to disband 12 armies to accommodate the loss of economic infrastructure. Overnight, a lot of people would have become pro-slavery. You'd see arguments like, well, yes, it is important and maybe freedom, but not right now.
Yeah, I look after my slaves.
I look after my slaves.
Yeah, I don't let mine run away.
I'm a responsible slave owner.
Yeah.
But we didn't, because that was not a conflict we were interested in, because we'd done that conflict, we're bored of it. What we wanted was the conflicts between my morals disagreeing with your morals and where.
And we hadn't created much game.
No, it hadn't.
It hadn't created much game because, as you say, all that happened is people quickly rechristened their slaves as indentured servants and just got on with talking about how important freedom was, except for these terrible criminals who deserved to be made to work on my plantation for free to make me juniper berries. So it didn't create conflict because people didn't want that conflict.
No, they didn't. It wasn't one they were looking for. I've forgotten where we got to.
That's fine.
We talked briefly about lineage and the Briar stuff. We wanted it to be opt-in. There are some.
Yeah, so heavy themes. I think there's a lot of attitude that Large Thess LARP is basically going to deal with people whacking each other with rubber sticks, and there'll be a big bad, and on the Sunday we'll all get together and defeat the big band. And then there's a bit of surprise that there might be some kind of themes in the game that aren't that simplistic and aren't that trivial. You know, we were always very clear in Empire that we were going to include some heavy themes: discrimination, prejudice, morality, the death of children, the death of innocence, and the death of the defenceless.
There's also players acting on those, right? Like they're the perpetrators of a lot of the things that you just spoke about, right?
Yeah.
Like I remember when we were first starting out, we played the Jotun a few times in the monstering battles, and through monstering, I learned to, because obviously who are the Jotun, we have a bit of a conversation about them. I completely sympathise with the Jotun. Like they're, as an enemy, I'm like, no, I actually I get what I understand their motivation. I know why they act the way they do, and it's a lot of the animosity can come from players in our own empire. You know, when it could, in theory, be a nation which should be friends of us, but we're not. You know?
I have a number of theories about how you can encourage players to dislike a group in the game, and one of the ways to do it is to make them nicer than the players.
Yeah.
And that is kind of what the young do. They're still not nice.
They do keep slaves.
But do they? Their thralls are protected and looked after, and not mistreated.
Well, I think we
but
cease to be a thrall at any time.
Could cease to be a thrall at any time.
There's just hundreds of miles of desert. You're welcome to try.
But that gives you a crack into which to get a crowbar of are the young really bad. It helps feed into that fun meme that I hate, which is are we the baddies?
Well, no, but that's it's obviously it's a meme and it's maybe overplayed sometimes, but at the same time, there are a lot of grey players. Let me put it that way: a lot of grey players. Like especially now I've been dipping my toe into the political world. Like there are some straight up villains in there who are selfish, who want to push their own agenda. At the expense of other things that are maybe beneficial to the Empire. You know?
Almost like the real world.
Extremely like the real world. In fact, the politics game is so much like the real world. I kind of went in there with very childish impression. I'm going to go there and I'm going to give a really good pitch and then they're going to elect me. You know what I mean? And there's so much more to that game. You know, like
we did a whole podcast about it. We spent a year, I think, trying to do a diplomacy podcast, and at the end, just gave up. And Matt used a lot of modern examples of political scenarios.
The Brexit one,
what we call the Brexit one. And it's been interesting over the last couple of years seeing some of the attitudes that we sometimes see in the real world portrayed by characters in our role-playing game.
Constantly scared these days because my other hobby is reading the news. I probably spend 2-3 hours a day reading, the American political news, geopolitical news.
I was going to say you've aged a lot in the last year, so.
I just that's my passion. But you read it, and half the time I'm thinking, oh my God, this reminds me of Empire. Yeah. Just the parallels between certain characters and things that are happening, and then you see it in reverse where. People will do things in the game, and I think, oh my God, that reminds me of something that happened 2 years ago, and it is. I think it's a real testament to Empire, to both to what we created as world builders
to the
and
players.
To the players. Yeah. That actually it is that realistic.
The first year there was a strong element of mutualism, of us all in it together against the Orcs. And it was interesting, in the second year that started to fall apart, but by the third year it was pretty clear that we now had a number of established players who were putting their interest and the interest of their nation ahead of the interest of the Empire as a whole. And that's when I think the game really started to kick off. Yeah. A lot of it, I think, owes roots to the fact that neither of us was interested in having evil in the game.
I think that the whole concept of evil, even when because I like Joanna Crombie. I don't know if you've ever read any of his books. I'm a huge fan of Joanna Crombie. In fact, I'm just listening to his latest book now. Actually,
he's a brilliant author.
But for anyone that hasn't listened to it, go listen to or read those books. They're fantastic. The First Law trilogy is where you should start. But there's a character in it called Glocta. Who's this? Basically, a lot of the book is written from the self point of view. I did it, whatever, and it kind of gets into this world. But there's this one character who's so morally grey. But my favourite character in all of fiction. He's a nobleman who was kidnapped in a war, tortured for many years, came back to his empire, this shell of his former self, and he got back and basically became a torturer himself. So, but
I think it's a
despite
testament-
him torturing people, I'm rooting for him every second of the book.
I think
right?
it's a testament to the way Abercrombie set stuff up. That when I finished the first Law Theory, I thought Glockter was probably the hero in the more traditional sense, most traditional sense,
and your actual,
while being terrible.
Yeah, and your actual heroes in it are not heroes at all, right?
No,
like you
they're
could,
awful people.
what's the guy with the really high pitched voice called? You know, anyway.
They're not awful people. They're just flawed.
Yes,
They're flawed people. They're real people responding to real situations in real ways, and they are neither angels nor demons.
We're in danger of getting into low fantasy versus high fantasy discussion.
it's fine. That's, I mean, if you,
Oh no, we've had it.
Okay,
a lot of
you only
times
go
in
for it,
different
okay,
places.
sure.
But we aimed for. We wanted a game that was at the lower scale of the social and political fantasy, while still leaving some space for magic.
well, on a micro level though, like my previous character was a fawn, supposed to be a very serious person. I didn't always stick to that, obviously, because it's just you end up falling back into yourself. But one like microcosm of that was not smiling. Right, my natural. If I meet someone, I smile. Like immediately, it's like it's programmed into me by society or whatever, you know. Trying not to smile was so jarring to try and become someone else that it really made me realise, like, wow, how much of me can I separate from to experience something else? And then, like, I threatened a character who was a passing comment for me. I just, if this thing doesn't happen, I'm going to come and get you, or something like that. Something really mean, and I walked away. So I bumped into the guy like a couple of events ago, and he was like, "Yeah, I've met you before." And he explained to me that I'd threatened him. I'd completely forgotten about it, and he was saying like, "I was so scared that I thought you were going to come and get me." He had to be walked back to his tent by his friends because of that, and I'd walked away. Whereas, like, I'm not the sort of person that's ever going to threaten anyone, or anyone should take that seriously, right? But in the world of Empire, you get to play around with grey parts of your own personality and see where you are, you know, where your personality might potentially end.
I've been to a lot of LARP games, and they start off with like you go to Serenity, and you go, right, you're all playing big damn heroes, or I've gone to like Celtic games, and it's like you're playing the heroes, and my baseline is I don't even know what that means. I'm not in it to play a hero. I mean, partly because I prefer to play the antagonist of the story rather than the protagonist, but mainly because real people are not heroes. Real people are not heroes. Real people are complex characters with and you see this all the time in reality. We'll dig up some Gandhi. If you go and read the history of Gandhi's a massive racist.
Yeah.
He goes off to South Africa when he's about 18 years old, and he writes some really unpleasant things about the black inhabitants of South Africa. He's a massive racist. There's the historic. That's not historical revisionism. You go and scratch the surface, everyone's like, he's a massive racist. He's also an extraordinary heroic figure who brings a peaceful revolution to India and throws off colonialism in India. It's like, is he a hero or is he a massive racist? And if you're demanding moral absolutism and moral purity from either your literary figures or your role-playing figures or your historical figures, well, you'll be disappointed in history, you'll read shit books, and reality will make no sense to you. There's no such thing as heroes in real life. It's grey. It's just grey all the way down. And
if anybody asks me what my favourite part of the podcast was, I'm going to say it's the bit where Matt talked about Gandhi.
It's just...
No, we want and we wanted a game in which people would play, because the closer they are to real people, the closer they'll take the game as if it's real, I guess.
I think if you dig into Martin Luther King, there's some quite unpleasant misogyny.
He was also he cheated on his wife a lot.
And it's like, my God, Martin Luther King. It's like,
John Lennon.
Nothing sacred.
John Lennon wrote Imagine, and then you play that to someone for the first time, and that's the most beautiful. Isn't it wonderful? Yeah, he's a wife beater. So, like, does that change the song? Right? It's
moral absolutism. If moral purity is your, and the thing that frustrates me is that's people's starting point. It's like, well, anything below absolute perfection is just not acceptable. And it's like, in reality, we all want to aim for up here, but we need to understand that no one ever gets up there.
A nice thing I think about Empire, and a testament to our player base, is that you can play somebody who is a hero. You can play that kind of straightforward, heroic character. We encourage people from Wintermark, for example, constantly to do it. But you're doing it against a backdrop of people who will make secret under-the-table deals with Druge and arrange for you to be sent on a suicide mission to get you out of the way so that they can present you as a martyr. And that is just players playing their characters. So you can play the hero as long as you understand that you're in a world where heroes get killed.
To pick another modern day historical figure, John McCain. For those who aren't familiar with presidential candidate McCain's history, he was captured in Vietnam and he was being tortured by the Vietnamese, and his family, who were very, very powerful back in American politics, did a backroom deal with the Viet Cong to get him released. And he said, I'm not going without the rest of my men. Now that's heroism. Whatever you think of these politics, completely wrong. That's heroism on an astonishing level. But you can only reproduce that satisfactorily in a game world with the real understanding that he must have been aware there was a good chance that that decision meant he was never leaving.
Yeah.
It's easy to look afterwards where he comes home and everyone pats him on the back and goes, my goodness, you're heroic. If you know triumph is inevitable, heroism is impossible.
In fact, I find that really interesting on the battlefield, because there are a lot of players who talk a good game, and when the shit turns south, they're the first to run. Do you know what I mean? And it's just like, it's quite interesting to see how... But on the flip side of that, there are people who surprise themselves and step up and become leadership through their own force of personality that maybe even surprises themselves, you know?
The Empire is a low fantasy world. It does not let you role-play being a hero, but you can be a hero. You just can't pretend to be one and get away for a long time.
There's a fascinating turning point in the campaign, in my opinion, which is and it's great that it has a name. It's the Battle of Ika's Tears, where the Empire slightly overconfidently storms onto a field expecting to find a couple of people in big foam costumes, and instead encounters a transit van style sized war rhino that rampages back and forth across the field, crushing people. And the numbers of dead are hard to say exactly. People throw out numbers like 100, 150 players lost their characters on that battle to the Thule, and the Empire was forced back in disarray through the Sentinel Gate. They suffered a crushing blow, and Wintermark, to my understanding, still sing songs and tell tales about that unspeakable defeat by the Thule and their war rhino. But I think it was at that point that it really crystallised that we were not running a game which you would win.
Now, and there's an interesting consequence here. It has a really fundamental consequence. So there's a subtle rule in Empire. We get asked this often by the players. We should put this on the wiki. Our Bob, Dave, and John have not come, and Sarah have not come back from the battle.
Don't bring me into this.
They died on the battlefield.
Yeah,
that was 2 hours ago. Can we go back and recover their bodies?
Right.
And the answer is uniformly no. Why is the answer uniformly no? Because a tiny handful of players, just a tiny handful, will go, I've just seen Dave. He's just been executed by that orc. We're not leaving without his body. If you know, you can go to the organisers 2 hours after the battle has ended and say, can we go and get Dave's body back? No one will heroically go and get Dave's body. But if you want your dead friend's body off a battlefield, you A, have to be astonishingly heroic, and B, have to take astonishing risks that likely will not pay off. It's not a game where it's going to go, oh, you took an astonishing risk. Well, it definitely comes off. 9 out of 10 times, you're dead too.
My character dying has made me into a complete coward.
Right.
I am so... Because the whole process of having to get new kit and build a new character and all that, and everything to do with it, and build up my reputation with different people, and I'm so scared of dying now. It's really... I'm going to have to... This next year, I'm going to have to learn to get my brave back, basically, because it's really affected me. I've basically just been running away from fights a lot. It's not really been I've been a runner, so it has kind of had precedence. Like, I'm not in a line fighting, but skirmishes, I'm like, that sounds like a bad trip. I'm not going to give it a miss. You know what I mean?
It's interesting to see how that's playing out. I don't think we really thought about it in detail when we were designing it. But losing your character is often opt-in. Because Anvil itself is largely safe, unless you've made some real enemies or are unlucky to some degree, your character, you won't lose your character unless you take it through the Sentinel Gate and risk it,
Yeah.
which gives you what you're talking about a little bit there. That caution, let's call it caution, about going through the Sentinel Gate, and that adds a level of perception of risk and makes it more heroic and dangerous.
But to be fair, though, this is coming off. We spoke about it on the last podcast where we were talking about drive it like you're renting it or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that was in my mind. Everything I did as my previous character, Irfan, I was rolling the dice every single time, pushing my luck, being the hero, right? Like being the person that stands aligned to rally troops around him, to push the weak flank that might expose myself to do it every single time. And I survived event after skirmish, after major battle, again and again and again and again and again. And then I act surprised when I actually do get down. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, when you're lying there and you've actually gone down, you're like, no, I did, this is... I deserve to be here. There's no... I'm not unlucky. This
Fate
isn't
has
something...
caught up with you.
Yeah, exactly. You roll the dice too many times and then double ones come down and then that's you, basically.
Snake
So,
We want that because if there's no chance of that happening to you, then everything you've done previously becomes a little more hollow. I think.
Without the fear of failure, there can be no triumph of success. There can be without the lows, there are no highs. And that, for me, has always been a theme of all the live role-playing games I've ever been involved with. I don't ever want to play a live role-playing game where I didn't think the fear of failure was actually genuinely real. We had one of our dogma for plot writing is, do not threaten to end the world. Why can you not threaten to end the world in Empire? Because PD have, at this time, no interest in ending the world. So don't write a plot where the world might end, because we're only running that plot if the world might end.
Oh, could I actually...
it's like,
this is
without
actually...
fear, there's no success.
Listener questions. Sorry, listeners, by the
Yes.
way. I will try and get through all of you. So this is from Samwise Samwell and from a good friend of ours called Robert Burden. They're very similar questions, so I'll kind of group them together. Is there a timeline for Empire? And I like this from Robert, though. Lots of us have backup characters when our current one bites the dust. Does PD have a backup game waiting for them when it runs its course?
Well, I think now's a good time for us to reveal our upcoming... No, go on.
Don't even... Andy, why would you even do that, man?
It's mostly Blood Bowl, but anyway, go on.
Oh, yes.
First of all, let's throw some
Talk about rolling dice.
interesting numbers at the wall. The first game we ran commercially was Maelstrom, and that was developed in four, maybe 5 months, and cost about £15,000 to develop and launch. And we ran that for 9 years. The next game we developed was Odyssey, and that took 18 months to design and launch, and we spent about £50,000 launching it. It cost about £50,000 to launch. Then the third game we created was Empire, and that took 3 years to develop. 3 years we worked on Empire before we launched it, and that cost around £100,000 to create and put live. So the point is, by that kind of progression, the next game that PD create is going to take somewhere in the region of 5 years to create and cost around $250,000 to launch. And what I will say is we haven't yet started. So we literally haven't started, and it is a minimum of 3 to 5 years to develop that game.
But
So
I feel like there's going to be I don't know, the same, like when I'm writing or doing something creative, or even when you're doing plot for Empire or running Empire, I'm sure there are little seeds inside your mind now that are kind of looked at and themes and general stuff that you might want to play with in the future, right? For me personally, it never really switches off. You know what I mean? There's always something that I can link into something else.
One of there's 3 acid tests with an LRP game. The first is, are players, even unknowingly, starting to get bored with this game? That's point number 1. Mm-hmm. Point number 2 is, have you realised you could run a better game? Have you started to think, you know what, we could run a better game than this? And then the third one is, are you bored of running it? And those are the 3 tests that start to put a little tombstone over a game, because once it starts to fail those tests, once people start going, you know what, the game's just not really going anywhere or whatever, they're losing interest, that's a problem. But the classic is that a game has been around for a while and it's gained too much cruft, it's got too much precedent that's now fixed and can't be changed, and broken things that don't work in the system. and so on and so forth. And after a bit, you start to think, you know, I've got a much better idea for a better game. I don't ever want to be running Empire and in the back of my head thinking, yeah, but we could be running this, and this is much better. So one of the things we do with Empire is every year we review it and go, what bit of the game would we change and rewrite if we were doing this from scratch, pretty much.
I know some players find it very frustrating, but that's why we periodically do a shake up on the rules. We will look, because the alternative is we stop running the game
And start running
something better. So we will look at something we think is fundamentally not working, or that we're not happy with the sort of game it's producing, and if we think it's merited, if it's not just a minor niggle, we will change it.
I think there's something to be said about the scale of Empire, where it's a, let's say if it's a, Empire gives you a toolbox with lots of different tools in it, right? Like each of the nations are a different tool, each of our foreign nations are a tool. And there's lots of different mechanics in there. So if you want to do something specific plot-wise, there's probably, you rummage around in the book and you probably bring out something that fits the bill, or you want to interact with this and kind of like change it that way, right?
There's a million pieces of plot that we could run in that setting. I don't believe I could exhaust the plot potential of the Empire world.
So you just need to look at, come up with one piece of plot for every Eternal for each of the 10 nations, and you've got 300 pieces of plot roughly, assuming you only want one piece of plot for each nation. That sort of element, that toolbox element, is one of the reasons that an early stage of all of every plot that our plot writers write for us is we do a plot development meeting over Discord in which they basically pitch their ideas, and we chat through them, and we say things like either that's good, that sounds good, I look forward to seeing how that goes, or here's an element you might not be aware of, or you could do that, but here's a different way you can.
So to answer the question, there are no plans of any kind at this point to replace Empire with a new game, none whatsoever. And doing that, going through that process, is a massive investment of huge amounts of time and money, and there's no plans of any kind to do that. And there's no lifespan on the game. It was deliberate.
Yeah, we left it open. We early talked about a sort of a shape, an arc that we thought the campaign might go through.
Yeah.
And we're only now, I think, just even getting close to one of the early milestones.
Yeah. I mean, I had a sort of mental picture of like, here's roughly 10 or 15 years of stuff that might happen in the world. And we're probably up to about year 2.
We're certainly not a long way in. The Empire, and the milestones are still coming. The Empire's only just recently conquered a legitimately new territory, Nossium. We've only just seen the end of the First Throne's reign.
Well, things are going to get very interesting for who takes that.
So let's scratch the surface.
Let's can I just talk about like maybe defining what, because we've talked about plot a lot. Could you maybe define what plot is and how PD puts that into the game?
The fundamental thing we do with our plot, I think, we talk a little bit. We use a lot of backstage jargon, and we try and differentiate between story and plot. And these aren't objective definitions, but we look at plot as a thing that is happening or happens that players can affect or something. Essentially, what we don't do is we warn all of our plot writers not to go into a plot with any expectation about where it will go next. Right. How it will end, what the outcome will be.
The D&D type attitude towards it.
Some of them are better at that than others.
Indeed, and it can be painful. It can be really painful. You set up a beautiful plot, and it's an example from a completely different game. But there's this wonderful plot, and a player has a weapon that destroys metal items and uses it on the metal artifact, and it's like, well, we can either say
the plot.
That doesn't work because we don't want it to, or we can say that's the end of the plot. And that attitude, that specific attitude, is the one that we take. We warn players. If your NPCs go onto the field and are
plot writers,
so if your NPCs go onto the field and are killed, then we won't retcon that. We won't roll it back. Nothing else. The plot will probably proceed without them. So we'll assume you've had a fair state. What is your fair state? What do you do if they don't do this? What happens if nobody's interested in the orphanage? Those are the sort of questions we like to ask a lot. Get the plot writer thinking about them, and if they're still happy to go ahead with the plot.
So my definition of plot is, I think many people's definition of plot, some people's definition of plot when they come to Empire is something mysterious is happening in the world. I'm going to interact with an NPC, discover that something mysterious is happening. Then I'm going to go on a quest, solve the mysterious thing by being heroic and overcoming the obstacle.
Yeah,
that is a trope of LARP in that is what we perceive to be plot. I perceive plot to be shit happened. What was that shit? Oh, I just don't care. I've no interest in what the shit was. I just want some shit to happen. My only is that shit happens. And for me, plot is the interaction of PCs. Because if we go back to what we talked about, that all of your most important interactions at Empire are with other players. So the plot is the interaction between you and other players. And my job as one of the plot writers for the world is to be having things happening in the world that cause you to want to have interesting interactions with other players. So, you know, a Grendel negotiator turns up prepared to offer a peace treaty with the Empire. Do you or do you not want to sign a peace treaty with him? We have no... You might assassinate that Grendel negotiator. You might bribe him. It could have gone to him and said, look, mate, I'll give you 20 rings of Ilium right here, right now, to go home immediately and say the negotiations failed. You know, all of these are all valid outcomes. The plot is not you interact with an NPC. The plot is an NPC over there wants that. What are you and me going to do about that? You want to talk to him. I don't want you to talk to him. You don't want me. You know, that's the plot. So I view our job as creating weather in the world. You've got up this morning and there's a hailstorm, or there's a snowstorm, or there's an earthquake, or there's a volcano, or there's a thing. The plot is what do you as the player base do about it?
Yeah, I find that interesting that you talk about it, because it's... I think when I first came, the idea of speaking to an NPC or something was something that would have been the highest echelons of where I wanted to be, right? Whereas that's kind of it's shifting now. As Empire has every event, it's always shifting in my mind of what it is and how I want to interact with it. But internal politics within my own banner, there's so much game right there, right? Like there's internal politics, there's different personalities, there's different goals. I'm kind of lucky that, well, or unlucky potentially, but we all kind of agree on a lot of stuff. So
there's a thing I saw a while ago. I'm not singling anybody out here. It's certainly not a one-off. In which somebody was saying, "Oh, I never get to have any plot," while simultaneously talking about how dreadful it is that the Empire won't do anything about the fact Sur Masuak has been conquered by the Jotun.
Right.
And I'm there thinking, you're arguing about what the Empire should do about the fact Sur Masuak has been conquered by the Jotun, but you're claiming you've never had any plot.
Yeah. I think the danger is because I'm guilty of this. I want to change the world, right? Like, and sometimes you can feel with 2,000 players, a lot of them significantly more experienced than me, better connected with titles galore, that it can sometimes feel that you're on the outside of that. Yeah. What would you say to that? Like,
I think. What would I say? And interestingly, this goes back to one of your earlier comments about does the game scale eventually start to drag the game down? There's always a risk in a game with only one player. You'd feel very powerful. You'd feel absolutely, I'm in charge of making the decisions about what happens here. The moment there's two of you, you're only making the decisions 50% of the time. Once there's 2,000 of you, you're not making a lot of the decisions. Your ability to influence them is quite limited. And it's easy to feel on the outside of that. It would be interesting to sit down with like a player like Roz, who played the Empress, and say, okay, you were right at the top. You know, how many times did things happen in the world that you didn't feel in control of? And I think you'd be surprised how often that did happen. That's my hunch, if she was being honest.
Yeah, I don't want to speak on...
No.
Because, obviously... But yeah,
the point
I think
is, I think in a way everybody's on the outside looking in. Everybody is aware that there are thousands of other people. Whether you're the general of the Drakes in the marches, or you are a yeoman in Dawn who's just come here at your first amber with 2 crowns in your pocket, I think everybody is at risk of feeling on the outside. And what you're trying to do is create a really dynamic world where lots of shit is happening, where if you push hard enough, you can at least be involved in those decisions.
For me, I kind of think about like it's the journey there. It's the process of that journey, right? It's not that I get to the end, because after my character died, right, you start to ask these kind of metaphysical questions about, you know, who was he, what did he actually achieve, and do all this stuff. But it was one hell of a ride, right? Like, and that was what the important part of that whole experience was to me. It's not the fact how it ended or if it ended. It was the different moments that happened along that journey and what that character could actually allow me to get involved in. Like, so that character wouldn't be what I'm doing now, but so different aspects of the game open and close to me depending on that personality trait or how you interact with those systems, right?
I think the point is that you want to try and make as much of the decision making visible and much of the decision making accessible. That's your point number one. Many years ago, first time I ever went to a Fest LRP, I played a military captain, and he was in charge of a small band of mercenaries. And my out of character goal was to get to the big military planning meeting for the weekend. There's 2,000-3,000 characters, but I don't expect to speak at that meeting. I don't expect to participate. I just want to be in the room. It's my concept of who I am. I'm a military captain. I want to be in that room. I spent 9 months building to that point of trying to get enough connections that I would get a ticket to that room. I got those connections. I spent the whole weekend. The planning takes place on the Sunday of a 4-day event. I spent the whole evening working, and then I lost contact with my invite an hour before the meeting happened, and I couldn't find him. I spent 4 hours wandering the site looking for him, found him an hour after the meeting had finished when he said, "Oh yeah, I'd have taken you in, but you weren't there when I looked." I missed the meeting. I could not get in the meeting. What's my point is, in Empire, you know when the military council meets. Any character can basically wander in and listen. You're not saying you get a seat at the table, because you don't. It's really hard. But if you're not happy, you can buttonhole that general as he's walking out and be like, "What the hell was, we've tried very deliberately to open up the structures of the world and go, the politics is on view. Yeah. I can't guarantee you a say, but you'll know where it's happening."
There's a player actually that I would really like to do an episode with, and he creates characters that really affect the world, right? So he'll do something where, like, a couple of different things that he's done. He did a plot where he was kind of against orcs and created a huge hubbub. Everyone was talking about it. Same thing, he did the same thing with Briars, but it creates this huge amount of plot for everybody else who's like, who is this guy? Like, we need to go and track him down and do all this stuff. And it becomes this huge thing, like, affecting multiple nations. And it's just one person going out there and being really good at pushing buttons, but like, it's gives the impression of he manages to give the impression of a much larger plot than just him. Do you know what I mean? Like, it feels like, oh, is there a secret society running around doing this stuff and all these shenanigans? Just one guy who's very smart, playing the game to its absolute hilt, you know? So,
yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, let's get into some more listener questions. Right, Phil Forrester, another good long friend of the podcast, he asks, will you ever consider going back to a 4-day event in the summer?
No. Yes.
I can't remember what was so bad about 4-day events.
There's 2 things that were bad about 4-day events. The first one is that the Easter bank holiday is very variable in terms of the weather conditions, and that is deeply problematic because it can be horrible weather. It can be, that we've had some dreadful Easter events. The second issue was that the second bank holiday that we're running clashed with the LT quite strongly. And was in the middle, crucially, this is also important, was in the middle of the student exam season. So it was traditionally our smallest event by miles. So I'm not wild about that second one. Clashing with the LT is just a downer. But being in the middle of the student exam season, having 2 bank holidays in the middle of the student exam season is just a pile of rubbish. Mm-hmm. If the government ever gets its finger out and sticks another bank holiday in June, I might just leap on it and be like, mine, I'm having it.
So you heard it here first. If you want to return to 4-day events, you need to elect a government that will put a bank holiday in June. Get to it.
Dear Boris, I know you don't know me, but
my friend said, if we had a really good quality site that had roads and great drainage and trees to provide wind cover, and it had some buildings on it, so that you could get in out the inclement weather and still be role playing, I might look at a 4-day Easter event.
Well, it's almost like you read my notes, because are we planning on ever getting a permanent site? And what would you do with that permanent site if you had one?
So, I actually spoke about this in public for the first time last weekend. We've registered a new company. I say we. I have. We have registered a new company, which we have created for the express purpose of buying and developing a permanent LARP site. We've got lots of hurdles to go through. We don't have a piece of land yet, so anyone's first and go, oh, where is it? It's like, and we've decided we want to solve a bunch of other problems first, and the big one is the money. So we are looking about how do we get, basically you need a shit pile of money. So it's like, okay, so we need investors, and we are working on that.
Would you be open, let's say this magical site appeared, it had all the ticks that you wanted to, location, a few other elements that you wanted. Would you be open to the idea of players being able to make structures there or to be able to affect the world, or would that be managed by PD?
Yes and no. I mean, first of all, if we get a site, it will, Empire will run 4 times a year there, and we would want to be renting it to the other games for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
So the first thing you've got to think, you've got to be looking at going, well, maybe that thing's right for Empire, but it's not right for other LARP games. You've got to think about that. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is you've got to think in reverse. Maybe somebody wants to build something that's terrible for Empire but perfect for their game. That's an issue. You've got to and then the next one is quality control. I think if we were putting something permanent on the site, we'd want to ensure that we hit a very high standard in terms of aesthetics and visuals and coherency and so forth. And those are issues about how we handle and manage those issues that we are proactively looking at the moment, and proactively putting sort of working teams together to think about how that is done, how it's communicated, how it's managed, because we want to get that stuff right before the first thing is built on the site. But yes, absolutely. If for those people who aren't aware of it, you should go look up a Canadian LARP site called Bicoline, which is in Quebec, and what makes Bicoline amazing is that hundreds of LARPers come there to create amazing things on the site. You won't get a stunning, amazing LRP site without that passion and enthusiasm from the hobby. It has to have games running there that are really excited and want to come there and create things. Otherwise, the cost of those things is just off the charts.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I would love to see a PD site, and I'd love to see what you do with it. Like, I don't know what that would be.
So
it would, but it's like,
it's easy. It's a circle of standing stones and a mage tower, after which you can do what you like. Those are the 2 things I have had on. These aren't new things.
To be
I've
fair,
been demanding these since year 2 of Mouse.
To be fair, I'm like, as long as there's a wooded section with a really nice fire pit area, I'm happy. So like something like that, we can get some benches up.
You can imagine amazing things. We've been trying to get a permanent site for 8 years. We came close twice, and it all went horribly wrong. But the growth of Empire has radically altered the financial aspects of it. The company has never been in a better, stronger position. Just never. So it's a very real prospect, but we're going to have to get a lot of investment capital together. We've got to find a lot of LARPers who are willing to basically go, actually, you know what? I'll put my money into this project.
So, Matt, I'll check my wallet after this. I'll see what's in there. Okay,
Sounds good.
Help you out. Okay, because right. So, another question from Phil here. What is more stressful for Matt? Sorry, Andy, you don't get to be involved in this question for some reason. Is it the lead up to the event, or the events itself, or is it event influenced by the weather? And then another question from Ian Mitchell here, which says, what evil genius did Matt get his infamous weather machine from?
So, the most stressful bit is, without a shadow of a doubt, the preparation and release of the Winds of Fortune. That is the bit that is just painful. That, you get to the point where you're working 18, 19-hour days.
Because it's massive.
Yeah,
it's huge. Because a group of players recently they recorded everything.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm like, it's a ludicrous challenge, and I pretty much had it on my TV on YouTube on play in the background while I was doing a bunch of other stuff. So I was cooking, it was on. I cleaned, it was on. I was hanging around doing whatever, it was on. It's hours of it. You know what I mean? Like, it's massive.
I know this is a question you've been asked, but I'd like to jump this in here. We write roughly, very roughly, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory 4 times a year. I looked it up online once. Usually the last job I do after we finish Winds of Fortune is I copy paste everything into a Word doc and do a word count on it, and it comes out as a short novel. these days.
4 times a year.
But
Four
I
times a
like
year.
that. But I know it's a pain for you guys. But from our point of view, it's actually kind of nice because no one's an expert on everything, right?
Yeah,
like there's
Got
enough
pros and
there.
cons.
Just very few people, I would say. I'm sure there are people, but
Yeah,
there's
no,
so
yeah.
much out there that no one can be like, I am the source of all knowledge and I know everything.
It's a
you know?
rich, detailed world where you can be constantly at the event meeting someone going, yeah, but you haven't heard about this. Oh, right.
Yeah.
That is the stressful part, without a shadow of a doubt. Once I get to the event itself, I often laugh about the fact that I get a lie-in because I'm not having to get up to take my daughter to school for the school run.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, I can go to sleep at 1 o'clock at night. It's like, it's just a doddle. So the events themselves these days are much easier than the prep.
I have seen you look a bit concerned some days when it's been slightly wetter than usual, and
The weather doesn't stress me; it just depresses me. That is the one downside. If we get a really bad weather event, it's just depressing.
It's 2019. It's outrageous that we can't, control the weather better.
Yeah,
there must be machines out there, right? Like,
Or Zeppelin hangers, but that's a different discussion.
the weird bit is the weather Empire has not had luck with the weather. Maelstrom, for the first 5 years of its life, was really lucky with the weather. Until year 5, we had just 4 years of very good weather. And then
Celestial Gala.
Celestial Gala was a big hit, where it was a kind of storm and a snowstorm and blah, blah, blah. And then it was just average after that, but Empire's really struggled. And but we've taken steps. We've moved off the Easter weekend. That has improved our weather. We've moved, so I think if we had a better site, then the weather would be better. And that sounds like the most ludicrous thing you can possibly say.
I agree.
But actually, if the site was bearing up under the rain better,
Yeah.
you wouldn't be as aware of, oh my God, it's a shit weather event.
The rain is bad, but it's the mud
It's the
that
mud.
drives
The
you
mud.
mad.
Well, it's
Yeah,
watching the some of the crew going around and fixing those drainage trenches.
Yeah.
Like I can't remember, is E1 they struggled at our first event, and then the next time it happened again, you could see them and they had a whole battle plan. They'd learned a lot from the previous one. But I can imagine a permanent site, you'll be able to have really nice drainage runoff and have a whole bunch of opportunities to do that. Also a parking area that you could probably manage more than the field, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so I think if we had a permanent site, we would have better weather. I think part of the reason that Maelstrom in those early years had great weather is because we were on scout camps, and they generally held up much better under the weather because they were designed and built. So we got bad weather once we moved on to farmers' fields, and effectively people don't really think about it, but actually the reason Empire has bad weather is because we're on farmers' fields.
Yeah.
And they just don't cope with the weather as well as a proper campsite would. So if we had a proper campsite, if we had a proper site, we would get better weather. So yes, I have. Where did I get that bad weather from? Well, unfortunately, I got that bad weather by doing a deal with the devil for a site.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've all been there. We've all been there. I said I want to have the most successful LARP podcast in the world, and
Yep.
I thought great, and here I am now. You know what I mean? It's hopefully it's all worth it. So
Your soul is a simple price to pay.
yeah. I've never really had much use for it anyway,
You
so
can-
it's not like a huge issue.
You can always get a rebate if you get buyer's remorse. It's fine.
Yeah. I thought I got a good deal out of it, to be fair. But right, Andy, here's a question for you.
Okay.
Phil again says, what influences Andy when he is down the plot mines?
I'm trying to choose my words carefully. I like to present players with difficult scenarios where they have to make painful decisions that they will hate making. Mm-hmm. So I look to that when I'm building stuff. I like to get at least one smug Easter egg in that only 2 other people will notice, particularly when I'm writing Winds of Fortune flavour text. I like to riff on fantasy tropes. I particularly like to invert them wherever I can, and also to rip off the words of authors whose work is now out of copyright. So mostly I'm just looking to have a little bit of fun so that I don't hate my job, but also make sure that we're making something where some players, or even just one player sometimes, gets to make a decision about something that they can later regret. So that's largely what I'm thinking when I'm down the plot mines. Don't underestimate the Easter egg thing, by the by. I will twist an entire plot just so that I can get a reference to an Ian Banks booking.
Okay,
And without shame.
Open question: which is the best nation? Cough, Highguard.
I really like Highguard. I still regret that it went quite as Warhammer 40k as it did, because I laughed when people said you've got to make sure it doesn't go to Warhammer 40k. I quite like Highguard. I don't think I have a favourite nation.
I love Dawn.
I like the Commonwealth, but
I love Dawn. I do like Highguard. I love Dawn. I mean, at the end of the day, they're all our baby. You know, I do like.
Yeah, I would only take 2 of them out of the back of the bike sheds and shoot them in the head. And I'm not saying which 2, but
are there 2? Would you have 2?
I'm mostly joking.
Mostly, okay, cool.
There was a point at which we had a long discussion about whether 9 or 10 was a better number.
If you are writing, if you're creating your own game, here's my one tip for success. If you're creating your own LARP game right here, right now, and you're building your setting, and you're building nations or factions or races or whatever, set yourself before you start a kind of conceptual number of how many there should be in the world. And then at the end of your design process, cut them back until you've met that number. And then probably cut one more as well, just for good luck. And when you tell yourself, no, I can't cut them, they're all so good, that will be true, and it will still be a better game if you cut. There's nothing wrong. All the nations in Empire are great, and I'm really pleased with them all. But it would have been a better game if we cut 1 or 2 and taken ideas and moved them into existing nations. Just because it's like jam that you're spreading on the toast, and it's like you just, you know, if you bunch the cool up, there's more cool in any given nation.
Yeah, it's interesting how similar that is to other creative pursuits. You end up having to cut deep into stuff that you care about just to make it concise and engaging, right? Like sometimes you can waffle on too much and it becomes so muddied, you know.
And then my tip would be, you know, if you learn how to do that, get in touch and tell me how that's done. Because
we to be fair, I think Empire is tighter and more concise than Maelstrom was, which had about 30 different affiliations
25,
you belong to.
25 different
and
factions,
but we
nations,
at
allegiances.
Empire managed to get it down to 10.
Yeah.
It was 9 for quite a while, and then went to 10 at the very last minute.
Yeah.
Imperial Orcs, in case you were wondering.
But
yeah, okay.
We were waiting initially going to have the Imperial Orcs, but some putative players made some very passionate pleas.
I think that I
around.
really like the Imperial Orcs and what because they're so different from every other nation.
It's a problematic brief in places.
Yeah, there are inherent, like you were talking about with conflict, inherent built-in conflict. The Orcs have that in spades, right? Like and that plot continues to happen in the world that we live in. Like I'm a huge fan of what they present and how different they are, and how isolated they are, and how different they are from everything else. You know.
Yes.
You know, I can't really talk about some of the stuff because it's kind of personal to my plot, so therefore I can't talk about it. But there are some really cool aspects to interacting with orcs and being friends with
the
orcs.
players have made that the case, I think, a lot. The brief is important there, but the orcs have played orcs as different to humans, I think.
Yeah.
I would say, because at the end of the day, you're not interacting with the brief; you're interacting with the players who belong to the nation.
Yeah.
I think for me, every nation has something I like about them. I love the mythic storytelling of Wintermark. You know, the crazy Hilger and the seal people and the Suak and the birds that carry your soul away and all those ideas. There's just lovely
but Wintermark, what I find interesting is that I can go. I've barely interacted with Wintermark, the largest nation on the field. Yeah. I have no context there. I've never had any plot interactions with them. But I don't feel like... So there's a whole world out there that I can go and experience. And it's one of my things this year is I want to make some Wintermark friends and try and get in there and kind of see what they're all up to. Because, there's... Everyone's got their own game because there's so much opportunity to do different things. There's lots of... You know, you can be busy mates with some Varushkans and have nothing to do with Brass Coast, for example. You know?
Yeah. My point is, I suspect if I was coming to Empire fresh... I'd be like, oh, let's see if we can get a Dornish group together. I love romantic Arthurian stuff. I love the visuals. I love the high.
There's enough difference in them that you could play 10 consecutive characters and have different feeling characters in games. I think. Yeah. I think there's enough blue water between the 10 nations that they just about work.
But if my mates were like, no, we're going here, I would just any nation would, you know, there's no nation was like.
There's a trivial little thing that cheered me up a little bit, which is when we were redoing the auras and the pre-skills. I think, is it the 10 Prides?
Oh yes.
The list of the 10 Prides was interesting to put together, trying to sum up what made each nation unique in a single word. So for Navarre, it's sacrifice, and that is the thing that this made-up author has said is the key thing to be proud of from each individual nation. And the fact we were able to knock those 10 together very quickly.
I wouldn't choose that word. I would choose practical.
No, because that's not something you're proud of in this context. It's about the national pride idea and how that worked. And the fact we were able to put that list of 10 together in sort of 15, 20 minutes.
No, we're actually kind of running out of time, and we haven't really talked about religion at all. And I'm not going to do it now. We're going to leave. I'm going to leave that because I feel like we could talk about religion for a really long time.
We did a podcast with Renner Robson on that one, which is on our podcast group.
Oh, really?
Whatever it is. Yeah.
I'll go listen to it. I'm always plugging the Empire podcast. And I really feel like
you can find it off the Empire Wiki.
Stop listening to this podcast and go and listen to that podcast. You know, it's very, very good.
Matt's currently working on recording a load of new content as well for that.
Yeah, I set a new podcast, but they're kind of conversations. Yeah, I love LARP. I love breaking it down and kicking holes in it and tipping it upside down and rifling through its pockets for change. So I just thought it would be really interesting to pick topics and things. And,
this is all that we do on our podcast. It's literally just a vehicle to have a conversation, and fortunately, people enjoy listening to that. It's not, The design of the podcast isn't for people to listen to it. It's a byproduct. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so next question. Scott Anderson asks, what's the difference between a Guardian and a Caliphate?
Thanks for
Caliphate, sorry.
Cataphract. Thanks for your question, Scott. It's a great question. But surely he's the player from Highguard. Shouldn't he be telling us what the difference between a champion and a Cataphract? You can answer that question.
So Cataphracts are heavily armed warriors. There's a strong emphasis on heavy armour, and there's a heavy armour mindset. We're going to form a shield wall. We're going to stand here in our plate armour and throw the enemy back. It's defensive. It's immovable. It's a rock. They have a historical descent which comes from the cavalry, and there's a wall-like mentality of like, we are going to hold the enemy back. Guardians, and they're heroes. Cataphracts are heroes. Everyone who's a Cataphract and is really playing into that is a hero. And I think there's a bunch in the Shattered Tower, and they do die a lot because that's what happens to heroes. Heroes die a lot. You've then got Guardians are... It's a bit like saying, what's the difference between a Navy SEAL and an infantryman? It's like Guardians are kind of a generic term for anyone who's a soldier or a warrior in Highguard. It might not even be your main preoccupation. It's a kind of, well, I'm really an artisan and a priest, but when we need to go out and fight, I put my armour on and I fight with the other Guardians. I guard the I can't remember what the bases are called now. The citadels, the chapter houses. Guardians are kind of your everyday soldier. He exists partly so that the Unconquered and the Cataphracts can know that they are a step apart. Why? What does the wiki say?
Oh, it doesn't entirely disagree with you. It's just a bit... No, what you're missing is that Guardians, particularly after we put an extra couple of words on them, are the elite guards who are based on defending the chapters, who are living a military life. They're not people who just randomly put their armour on. That's Highguard citizens.
You're right, actually. Yeah, it's fair.
Yeah. And your argument of the Cataphracts as being defensive was also making me wince slightly. We don't really talk about that. The difference is that the Guardians,
kind of shock troop.
The Guardians are elite guards, soldiers, protectors of things, whereas the Cataphracts are, to quote the wiki, living standards. They are very clearly our paladin archetype, who get out there burning with righteous fury and twat the enemy. So in a way, the difference between them is their focus. If you look at Highguard, there's an interesting conflict between that kind of... in the way they do their devotion, between their discipline and their zeal and all that sort of stuff. And what we've pulled out a little bit there, particularly when we spent a bit of time to actually think about Guardians, is that Guardians are serious, no-nonsense soldiers who are about Highguard and their chapter, and the Cataphracts are your larger-than-life knights and champions who are there in their heavy armour, yelling for the Emperor, or Empress as appropriate, and leading the charge forward to convert the enemy. And with the Unconquered, they create three very different ways in which you can play a Highguard military character, which is how our archetypes are meant to work, to give you hooks, build your characters on. So
Well,
Scott, that's what I would say is probably the difference. Now that I've had enough time to jump on the wiki and find out what we've actually said.
It's interesting because obviously Andy probably knows the world better than anybody alive. I don't have a very good memory, but I helped write it. But even we need to go back and go, okay, what do we? Oh yeah, I remember now. You know, it's like I don't play in High Guard. I haven't read the High Guard brief in months, so it's like I have to. I will be off. I would have to go and refamiliarise myself to be able to answer a question
It's
like
the
that.
same problem that I've talked about with the Commonwealth before. We've written the stuff, we created the world, but we also have our own prejudices about it.
Yeah.
Because large amounts of the world is a combination of at least 2, sometimes 3 or 4 people's work. So we have to go back to the wiki to refamiliarise ourselves.
How
with
many
things.
times in the last 7 years have we gone rah, 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 and then one of us will go and check and go, you know, that's not what the wiki says.
Yeah.
We're like, oh, you're right. Yeah, we're wrong about that, aren't we?
And then we have to play paper, scissors, stone to see if we change the wiki or change our minds.
Change our minds. We usually change our minds.
We usually change our minds.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for your question. You win the
Yes,
most
Scott.
controversial question of the podcast so
Yes,
far.
Scott,
So,
thanks.
but leading into Callum, my good friend Callum Jessup, who actually plays Sinwig and all the radio play stuff that we do for the intros and outros. Is it pronounced GIF or GIF?
It's clearly GIF.
GIF?
It's graphics. Blah, 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 blah.
Interchange format.
Yeah, so it's GIF.
Yeah, it's GIF.
Well, there you go. You heard it here, folks.
It's it's GIF.
We have
I can't understand why it's even a question.
Oh yeah.
Next question is from
Shocking.
a young, long-term listener of the podcast called Andy Raff, who's a cheeky little chap. He asks, I hear Andy has a Patreon where he often writes about Empire stuff.
This is
Can you
outrageous.
plug that, Andy?
Thanks, Andy. You sound like a person of true discernment. Yes, I have a Patreon in which I write about Empire. I've got a WordPress blog, of course, as well, where a lot of that material will turn up and a lot of more random things. You can find both of them on the internet by going to either Patreon or WordPress. Thanks for asking. A very discerning question. Much better than Scott's.
I want to have a shower with how dirty I feel right now.
It's the internet. We're meant to cross-plug.
Right.
There's a comedic element to that, which I think actually hits on something that's kind of serious. Periodically, people will email me or say something like, "Oh, I'm writing a book of, like, I'm writing a story that I want to publish. It's set in the world of Empire. Like, is that possible? You know, what is the copyright? How much does it cost? You know, you're like, no, there's no cost. There's no. It's like I make money off the world of Empire. PD makes money off the world of Empire. Why on earth should we be offended if anyone else makes
I didn't
money?
even think about that stuff. Our intros and outros are pretty much set in an altered version of the. So please don't sue us there.
We've got a very
Not that there's any money, but
we've got a very open Creative Commons on our
Style
wiki.
license,
yeah.
Because I'm genuinely serious about, you know, it's a shared intellectual property, and it's cool when people find ways to make that interesting enough that people want to pay for it.
Okay,
That's
like
just awesome.
we talked about this earlier with the scale and 2,000 players. I'm actually lucky enough to go to a couple of player events later in the year, and they are going to offer me that in small scale interaction with NPC, 25 player in a castle. And it's going to be bonkers. It's going to be, but it's all within the same world, and I get to develop my own character in that place. So it's like there are options to expand and learn. And
we wrote some things into the brief with the solid intention that they would only be used at player events. I'm thinking specifically of High Guard's bathhouses. There's no way we can do those on the field, but we've had at least one highborn event that has taken place in a Turkish steam bath.
Roads in
Well, have I
Rushka.
not been to? I want to go to that.
The whole horror dynamic in Varushka we talked a lot about and left it in because while it's tricky to do that scale of horror at a large event, it's perfect for running a small event in which you can properly focus.
I should be going off to Spiral, and it's going to be bonkers.
And then you see
it's going to be full on.
There's been some. We've basically there's 2 types of player event we mostly deal with. The social player events where players just get together in character and do things in character. We hear about them, but we rarely have to do anything because they're just playing characters. I think the most recent one, it was Chris Terry and his gang did Nemesis 2. They'll write a plot. Triage is another one. Dave Young's No Return, and they'll basically tell us what their plot is going to be, just like they were one of our plot writers, and we'll give them some development
And
advice
we've
and
had
things.
crazy pitches for ideas. We've talked about like running a Utoon event where everyone plays a Utoon
I
sits down
still
and
wanna
work
do
out
that.
what they're going to do about these terrible things the Empire have done.
I remember
That's
Michelle
really fun.
Taylor pitched one in which the Eternal Elenrith kidnapped a load of people and did experiments on them, things like that. They're not things that we would run or could run at a large event, but I really like the fact that people are investing enough in our world to run their own cool events.
And the setting was written with that in the corner, in the kind of back of their mind was like, we want detail in this world that will be fantastic for a small scale game.
Yeah.
It's not, because we wanted people to be able to...
I'm so excited about attending them. I can't. It's because it's like I've experienced now like 7 events at Empire, but it's going to be cool to experience it on a smaller scale among people that I'm not going to know everyone there, but I'm going to know a few people, and it'll be like, especially Ian's character Talis. He's got I think it's going to be really beneficial for him because there's certain parts of his character that are going to be really beneficial to be viewed under a tiny little...
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? The pressure of a smaller situation.
It's something that Matt touched on earlier. You get different types of experiences with different scales of games and different types of plays. I know. I think Renner and Busby ran an event for like 12 players, which was a deeply personal game of horror and guilt,
and
self-exploration and weirdness. Utterly alien to the way that we do LARP, but I'm so pleased that they were able to set that in our world.
In any way, shape or form with Profound Decisions Empire. Everything to do with the shared world of Empire and the characters that live within it. I'm always really excited when people come to us and talk to us about a sanctioned event that is innovative, imaginative, that is aware of the size and scale of what it's doing and has been built a game around that, and is like Chris Terry's, where he does living sandbox events where effectively he goes, this is the map of the area and these are the forces that are present, and the players are going to spend 2 days moving through this area, going where they want, encountering these things. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. That's not an event or a game we can run.
There's a load of cool things like that. Was it Tony Porteous and group who did Triage?
Yes.
Who did some beautiful things with our traumatic wounds, which are really difficult for us to duplicate on the 2,000 player scale, but just took the traumatic wound idea to another level and built a whole event for medics, of all things, around that idea of making the traumatic wounds more in depth and a major hook for the game.
But occasionally we'll steal. I think the last battle, the players got out on the battlefield, and then there were all these people they had to triage to help, who had complicated chain of and there was all this kind of weirdness for the surgeons, and there was stuff they had to do, and some of them failed. Half the patients died because they couldn't solve the complex problems, the medical problems these people had. And I wrote that partly inspired by Tony's stuff from Triage too. So Triage rather. So it all feeds.
We really like player events.
They
keep a lot of them take place over the winter months as well. They keep people's enthusiasm buzz up. We've some of the people who've run them have won LARP awards, which is nice. I think No Return won best player event.
I think, I started my event running career by running sanctioned events for another large scale fantasy bank holiday system. It creates a great platform. You've got your audience, you've got your rule system, everybody knows the world, everybody knows the setting, everybody knows the characters. So 70% of your work is done for you, and you can concentrate on just the stuff you need for your event. So it's a wonderful way to get into LARP event running. And I'm always really passionate, and particularly with Empire. Empire was a real bugbear. It's like, I want this game to be a framework that will help people learn their craft as event runners and go, you know what, I don't need Empire anymore. I'm going to create my own game and my own setting, because I've had the safety net of running events in an environment where the rules are done, the audience is done, that now I can go without the safety net. So awesome.
Yeah, we want them from the very beginning. We're pleased. I think we're both pleased with how popular they've proved as a thing that people,
and how broadly the feared problems have not transpired. So good.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, one last question. We're really running extremely low on tape here. So this is from my friend Tom Llewellyn. He would like to inquire, can I buy your shoes?
I've only got the one pair of shoes.
You didn't say no, though, did you? I mean...
I wonder if this is a reference. Has he met me in character?
No, he's actually...
Because you sold your shoes to... Was it Ree or Lucas?
No, I think it was...
Hold on, so this isn't...
Jerry.
That was meant to be a joke question, but you have actually sold your shoes to someone.
Shoes, yes.
In character at an event?
In character at an event, yes. I went to a game of Arkfall. Great game. I only managed to get to one of the games, but it was a tremendously fun game. I was playing a ludicrous hat salesman. That was my concept. I'm a man selling hats. I had a bowler hat that I was trying to sell people, and I was just trying to make money by any means possible. And it was a very, very muddy event, and it's about an hour before the event ends, and this guy goes, I don't want to buy a hat, but I want to buy your shoes. And I sold him my boots and walked out of his tent to Strug building with nothing on my feet. Kind of went through.
Well, there you go, Tom. If
for the right price,
there's for the right price.
If you meet me in character, my shoes definitely.
Well, we said we weren't going to bring it up.
Yes.
Right, cool. Well, that's the end of my questions. Hopefully, I haven't missed anyone off. Apologies if I had. Thank you both so much for sitting down with us again. We'll probably do one again, hopefully at some point. Maybe this time next year if we're still going.
Cool. That'd be fun. Winter's always a good time.
Yeah, it's like it gives me something to do anyway. So I'm sure people appreciate you taking time out to speak to us. So that's fantastic. As always, thank you very much for listening. There will be more episodes coming out. I'm not sure when this one will be out, but we're going to release a whole plethora of different specials. And always, thank you so much to our very generous patrons who help me out with a little bit of petrol money to get up here. So thank you very much, guys, and we'll join you again on the next one. Bye-bye.
Right, this path is getting to be more swamp than path. We should try and source ourselves a boat before going any further. Those villagers might be able to help.
Look what we have here, Beryl. More monster hunters, Mavis. Could be, Beryl, but these two look like they're more likely to catch a cold than a monster.
Good day, ladies. We're looking to hire a boat.
Well, you're shit out of luck. Practically everything that floats has been chartered, bought or stolen.
Didn't know this part of the world attracted so many visitors.
They don't usually, but since all the trouble in Two-Starf and that reward that we're offered, we've had all sorts pass this way. Seems like every bloody warden, yeoman, fawn and knight errant in the Empire has passed this way of late.